So let's get into the anatomy, if you will, of an argument and what that's all about. What I'm going to be using as a foundation theory for this is what's called the Toulmin model. The Toulmin model was something that Stephen Toulmin wrote about in his groundbreaking 1958 book, The Uses of Argument. Um, the Guardian, a news service in the UK, it talks about Stephen Toulmin in his obituary. It says Toulmin made his mark as one of the leading proponents of the good reasons approach in ethics and went on to write about reasoning, science, philosophy of science, and the history of ideas. He was ultimately better known in the United States field of communication and in computer science, more so than in philosophy. His book, The Uses of Argument, which inadvertently made him a founding father of argumentation theory, criticizes the way that philosophers treat reasoning as a chain of time-free written propositions, that they are cemented rather than practical, more ebb and flowing propositions that can be debated in particular situations. So he gets away from that concrete idea of truth and makes things a little bit more debatable through that philosophy, and that's one that I adhere to as well. So here are the parts that way to an argument. There's claim, grounds, the warrant, backing, rebuttal, and lastly, qualification. So I'm going to go through all of these in sequence as argumentation is a process that way. Okay, so first off is the idea of the claim. And the claim is it's the proposition, or it's might be your position that's being argued, and ultimately it's the conclusion of the argument. Okay, and there are basically three types of claims that we can be making out there. The first one being a value claim, like abortion is wrong. The second one being what's called a policy claim, like all assault weapons should be banned. And the third one being a fact claim, like Wall Street is responsible. Well, what makes these different from each other? I'll explain. First is the value claim. We use the proposition here, abortion is wrong. So value is derived from the idea of evaluation, right? So when you evaluate is when you get into a value kind of proposition. Wrong, right, light, dark, good, bad, evil, righteous, and so on. Those are evaluations. And once you use that kind of terminology in your position or in your proposition, chances are you're into a value debate. There can also be a comparison. We're comparing things back and forth. So like this proposition, rights of the fetus outweigh the rights of the mother. Here we're comparing rights of the fetus and rights of the mother that way. So that becomes a value kind of claim. And then lastly, actually there are lots of different types of value. The three main ones though is where you can argue harms, okay? Abortion is dangerous, so it's harmful. It's harmful to the mother. It might render her sterile or whatever the case might be, okay? Look for other videos about this. I'm going to get into all types of argumentation, like value policy and fact, a little bit later on in more detail. Okay. Next is then the idea of policy, and policy is an interesting, probably the most prevalent type of claim that's out there because it's one that promotes some kind of process to go through and make it so. And typically within any resolution, in any policy resolution, is the word should. Okay, that word goes through and indicates that some process needs to be made. It could be legislative, it could be a judicial process, an executive process that makes that happen. All right. And then lastly, within the types of claims that are out there is the idea of fact. And the fact claim is based on that verb to be. What is not. Okay, what has happened, what has not happened, what's true, what's not true, what may occur in the future, that kind of thing. Fact cases tend to focus on cause and effect in natural phenomena. They focus on cause and effect and things that impact the economy, like this one here, like Wall Street is responsible. Is responsible for what, though? That's where we get into definition. We'll come back to that later on. All right, so the next step then in the argumentative process, once we've got the claim out there, we want to get into the grounds. On what grounds then is the claim operative, okay? These are reasons or evidence that supports that claim. And we're going to talk about evidence in another video as well, because it's pretty imperative that we understand this whole concept of the importance of evidence, because it's based on that evidence that the next item in the process of argumentation, the warrant, becomes substantiated. Okay? That warrant is the actual chain of reasoning. It's that principle, it's that provision that connects the grounds to the evidence, or that connects the evidence rather to the actual claim itself. And it's based here. There are two parts to this. One being a claim that comes up within the warrant, and then the other one's the reasoning that supports that. So here's a typical warrant, an implied warrant, I guess, within a proposition. Needle exchange programs should be abolished because they cause more people to use drugs. Well, the inherent claim here is that needle exchange programs should be abolished. The warrant then goes through, the unstated warrant goes through and says, well, the reason why is because they cause more people to use drugs. Okay? So it's kind of an if this, then that. And the warrant goes through, and a good solid warrant goes through and establishes kind of a higher level of that claim or reasoning. Okay, sometimes they're not explicit, and sometimes they are, and we'll talk more about that. Next in that process is backing, or what I call it's evidence here. Really, it's support. It directly or indirectly backs up what that warrant is talking about. So if we go back to that previous proposition, we can get into statistics about increased use of IV drug use because of needle programs, or we could find statistics that say, no, actually more people are having less disease as a result of the needle exchange programs, right? So we can use statistics really to go through and back up or tear down what it is that we're doing. There are lies to analyze in statistics. So we'll get into that as we talk about evidence. Then what kind of closes this whole argumentative loop is this idea of rebuttal. And it should be said here that no argument exists independent of clash. Okay? You got to have rebuttal. There's got to be something that comes back and clashes with that. So the rebuttal goes through and it provides some exception to the argument itself. It gets counter examples. It provides counter evidence. It gets into counter argumentation to the rebuttal. And that takes that argument then to the next level. And eventually that level brings us to some concept of qualification. Well, how do we know who's right, who's wrong? And really that boils down to the qualification. It's that criteria by which that argument follows. And for a lot of people, they have to define what that criteria is. What is that qualification? And for many, it seems, it's just an agreement to disagree, which drives me crazy. The problem with that is lots of claims are reduced to some level of an assertion. Where claims are supported by warrants, assertions really are based on opinion. And opinion doesn't have a solid place in argumentation. It doesn't have a place in reasoning, because an opinion really is just based on belief systems. It's based on your frame of reference. It's what we call a supposition. You can't prove it. Okay? Where successful claims, the winning arguments, are the ones that have the most solid reasoning and valid evidence. They're based on evidence. The problem, what's truly becoming frightening and disconcerting, is that that kind of public discourse has disappeared in governance. Okay, it's based on opinion. Very little evidence, or evidence that is brought forward is manipulated, like this snowball, to prove that climate change isn't happening. The problem with this is that just by saying things makes them so, and it doesn't. We're seeing that currently in our campaign season. Just by saying things, the politician, the candidate, seems to think that just by saying it, it makes them so. It doesn't.